Aló. over the house. Yeah, feel free to give me your questions. I don't know if I'm ready to play Bach for you. Somebody wants to know about my cello. This is a very special instrument. I'm very lucky to have it. It's a Gaspar de Salo, and there are only 2 of them in existence that I know of. There might be a third, but it was made in the 1580s. It's one of the oldest cellos around, and it was originally some sort of bass, large bass church instrument. If you can see it, the F holes are gigantic. So 1580s, it was cut down. It must have been a gigantic instrument, probably in the late 1600s. This scroll has an extra turn in it, if you can see that. The back is quite beautiful. Has the place for the peg for the strap that would go around the cellist's neck, playing standing up. It's a very beautiful instrument. What I like about it is the depth of sound, especially on the lower strings. It's great for a quartet. It really has a solid bass foundation. Oh, do I have the screen on mirror? Shoot, what have I done? Okay, let's see. I'm not left-handed. Let me figure out how to change that. Any advice for... Yes, it does have a hole in the back for being carried in church services or outdoor festivals or whatever they decided to do with that. I don't know how to change... Somebody wants to know how to teach vibrato. I mean, there are many ways of thinking about vibrato. It depends on what level of vibrato, where are you at with your vibrato. With an advanced student that's developing different kinds of vibrato, speeds of vibrato, colors of vibrato. It's hard for me to remember exactly how I learned to vibrate, but I remember doing many, many different exercises to develop the rotation of vibrato and exercises to develop evenness in vibrato with using a metronome, practicing in rhythms, like starting off with 8th notes, going to the note, and then speeding it up with a rhythmic triple, 8th notes. And then eventually finding the vibrato that way. But there are many different vibrato exercises. I like working on my vibrato when I'm warming up. I like to focus on developing different speeds of vibrato. So I'll do exercises where I will just take 4 notes in a position and work on... So maybe going from very little vibrato, some more vibrato. I feel that vibrato can shape a phrase, and we often forget this. A lot of people have vibrato, and it's sort of autopilot, and you just vibrate and vibrate. But if you think about the phrase and where it's going and how it's developing, the vibrato can really be a shaper in speed and width and intensity. So, very good question. Let's see. How do you practice double stop passages? Oh boy. Well, double stops are very, very challenging. I think one of the issues with practicing double stops and approaching double stops is that you think of double stops as being very hard, and oftentimes put twice as much energy in your double stops as you would playing singular notes, and it's actually the opposite that you want to focus on, that you want to put less pressure and not overpress the hand. It's more about being balanced in a double stop. So to have a light touch, to have a soft hand, and have a good position, I think is really, really important. There are many ways of practicing double stops. I try at least every day or every other day to do a little bit of from Starker's book, an organized method of string playing. Just taking one position and finding the intonation in that position. There are a million different combinations you can do. Then taking another position and practicing all the different double stop combinations in that position, such as fourth position. And then connecting those two positions with all the possible combinations. You can do it from a low position to a high position. You can do it from two different strings to two other strings. But it's it solidifies your intonation, creates hand strength, geographic knowledge of the fingerboard. I find that book incredibly useful. Kosman also develops these same things with also different combinations of coordinating your fingers in different patterns. There's the the thumb position one. Anyway, there's a bunch, but even doing your scales in thirds and sixths and octaves, playing octaves and scales up and down the instrument. I love double stops, and if I do a lot of them, I feel ready to go for the day. I feel my intonation is there. I feel I understand the fingerboard. I feel strong. It gives me confidence. So, yeah. Let's see. I'm missing a bunch of questions. Do you think that cello quartets will be just as common as string quartets once the repertoire keeps expanding? Well, I mean, we're missing some great repertoire. I think one of the great things about the string quartet repertoire is that, all the greats wrote some of their best works for string quartet. We're talking about all the great Haydn quartets, and the Beethovens, and the Mozarts, and the Mendelssohns, and the Schumanns, and the Brahms, and the Bartoks, and the Shostakoviches. Can other groups, genres of chamber music catch up? I don't know. You don't have all that history. There are some great works for cello quartet, but I have to say, one of the reasons I play in a string quartet, the main reason is the repertoire, and the music that we have for the string quartet is hard to beat. But I hope maybe people should write for the cello quartet. I love it. I'm a cellist. Let's see. What is the best way to get a beautiful tone on the high notes on the A string? I have trouble above sixth position to get a beautiful sound. Well, I think in the high positions, what happens when your tone is not the way you want it is that there's a little bit of fear up here. We're afraid of this area. And so because we're afraid, we add more tension and we try harder. We're a little bit worried about being up there. It's a little less balanced than down here. Comfortable, right? You get up to here. I find this area also very challenging. But what happens is if we're not balanced in the hand and the arm, things get tight. The shoulder gets tight. The wrist and the elbow get tight. And that's when the vibrato can get tight and the sound gets tight. And what happens, we're up here, we start to do crazy things with the bow. We lose contact. We start to slide around. We squeeze. We force the sound. And then you also will have difficulties getting a beautiful sound. So I think you have to remember, you have to stay relaxed and easy. You also have to find the right balance. So where is the elbow? Where is your balance on the finger? Is it really on the fingerboard? Do you feel balanced here? Are you overpressing? And I'll say it over and over. I think that's one of the biggest problems is trying too hard, not being soft enough in the hand, pressing too hard. And then you hear it in the vibrato and the sound. So try to find a way of being balanced and relaxed. Good question. Very good question. Okay. Does anybody have any advice on, I think you're seeing me playing backwards, and I'm not sure which button. Suzanne has asked about some ways to practice scales and arpeggios. Well, I try to do, especially being quarantined, I've had more time than I've ever had to warm up and to work on my scales. And so I have a general method. I mean, there's the violinists from Galami and have certain methods that I grew up listening to and cellists use nowadays. I like to do accelerated scales with the metronome, starting off with slow bows, maybe 2 to a bow, and then 3 to a bow, 4 to a bow, and so on. And different bowings, starting in different parts of the bow, different articulations. So depending on what I'm working on, if there's a passage that I'm having problems with, I will incorporate that into my scales. Arpeggios, I have a routine of arpeggios. I'm working on intonation. I'm sorry that I'm turned around backwards. I am a right-handed cellist. I think one of the most important things about arpeggios are the string crossings and how you approach each string crossing. And somebody else has, these are good questions. Somebody else, is there any exercise for tips you would recommend for cross string slurs? I think the arpeggios, it's not just about the intonation and the shifting, but also what your bow is doing here. So I like to think about what my arm is doing. Every string crossing involves a leading motion, a circular motion. So is the hand leading, followed by the arm? Is the arm leading, followed by the hand? And there's a great exercise for string crossings that Steve Doan has in his book, where he works on the different string crossings, and he talks about the circular motion. Sometimes it's a counterclockwise motion, sometimes it's a clockwise motion, sometimes it's led by the wrists and fingers, followed by the arm, sometimes it's led by the upper arm, followed by the fingers. So there are many things to think about for string crossings. I love that exercise to warm up, just to focus on, so that I can work on my circles. So as I'm going from a lower string to a higher string, it's a counterclockwise motion. If I'm going from a higher string to a lower string, it's a clockwise motion. Different parts of the bow, you're going to have different parts of the arm leading it. I find that a great way to warm up. And if I have to sit down and play Bach with all the different string crossings, I feel a little more secure in what I'm doing. Somebody asked if I practice long tones. Yeah, I'll do that usually in my scales to start. Just really slow long tones to find a really focused sound, and see how long and slow I can play my bow without cracking or bubbling and without any excess tension. So just sitting on a note. And this is something I think Gingold was famous for doing in master classes, where he said he could do a bow for like 5 minutes and just sit there and slowly play out a long tone. I think it really develops control in your hand and balance in your fingers, just to be able to play a long note. I mean, much slower than that if you can. There's a lot of good questions here. Somebody wants to know if I prefer a heavier bow or a lighter bow. I don't know. I've played on a light bow, and I feel like I can control it very, very well. But I love the sounds. I've tried some heavier bows, and I really enjoy the sound that I get. I just don't feel I have as much control. I feel like I work a little harder. But I've been playing with this bow for such a long time that I haven't really thought about it enough. Some people have a million bows, and they'll use this bow for this piece, and they're constantly changing bows and thinking about their bow. I don't think enough about it. I'm pretty happy with what I have, so wish I could answer that better. Somebody wants to know the difference between spiccato and sautille. Sautille stroke is sort of an on-the-string springy bow, as opposed to staccato stroke, which is something we use in classical repertoire in the string quartet all the time. The bass line where you're sort of it's a bouncing stroke, but it's not from the string. Where you're letting. I wish you could see the bow better. I gotta scoot back. Apologize, I'm not so good I don't have anybody helping me here. So when you're playing Elgar Concerto Second Movement, that's a sautille stroke. Spiccato is played in, like I said, a lot of the quartet repertoire, and it's a stroke that uses a little bit more upper arm, where you're dropping the bow on the string, as opposed to a bowing that you develop a springing motion in the bow, basically from the string. Yeah. Laura asks about exercises for smooth bow direction changes. Certainly it's something that I think about in my scales a lot. I think legato bowing, smooth string crossings, smooth bow changes are extremely important, and I like to think about that in my scales because I can focus on just that. And I feel if I've done that in the morning, then when I'm in my repertoire, everything is easier. It has to be incredibly fluid, and it's challenging. For me, it's about circles, and I even spend time maybe doing open strings, thinking about it. So that there's something leading the string crossing. So if it's at the upper part of the bow, there's going to be a circle up here, so that the bow is being prepared for the up bow, so that it's not just that, but there's a preparation. So if you see my upper arm is already beginning that circle to prepare for the up bow, as opposed to a stop and a start. But I think so much of cello playing and good cello playing has to do with smoothness in a circular field. I was talking about string crossings and these circular motions. Legato bow change is a similar thing. So being aware of that preparation. Then at the frog, it's a different kind of circle. It's again, there's something in the elbow that's preparing my down bow. And there's also a freedom in the bow. I almost think of it as letting that hand be free, so the finger's still going, and I'm already turning my bow with my elbow, so that the arm is preparing and coming this way. My first finger is still on the move. It's like when you whip a rope and you're pulling it back, and the end is still heading in that other direction. So it's a very, hopefully a very free feeling at the frog. But it's got to be practiced, and I feel if I don't warm up a little bit like that every day, my legato suffers. So, very good question. Oh, here's a question. Somebody wants to know, they find it hard, Michael, to get a big sound when on the C string without getting tense. Any tips? Yeah, the C string is different. I mean, it depends on how balanced you are there. I mean, for me, it's in a way can be easier if you feel the arm weight, and sometimes I find it hard to get that weight on the A string because you're way over here. But here I like to. What helps me is leaning into the lower side of the instrument, and I feel that I can relax and pull out that sound. And it's flow through the C string, led by a relaxed shoulder. If you're having trouble on the C string, I would imagine maybe you're kind of muscling it a little bit, working up here, but finding that balance, relaxing this big joint, and again an ease in the bow hand. The other problem you might be having on the C string, you might want to check your bow angle. If your bow is crooked, you're going to start to force the sound. You're not going to like it. If you find a good angle in your bow on the C string, you can produce a certain kind of sound with very little effort. But I would think about this upper part of the arm and what's going on there. Getting a lot of really good technical questions. Does anybody have any questions about repertoire, or could be about quartets? And I like these warm-up questions and technical questions. I've been thinking a lot about them. I've been spending a lot of time thinking about the exercises that I'm having my students do and what their uses are. So I have a stack of books right now, of exercise books that I've been paying attention to. I've got the Fiara exercises, the Starker book, Kosman, the Sevchek bowing exercises, the Sevchek shifting exercises, of course the Popper etudes, which are fantastic as little pieces, but they each have something that can be applied to the repertoire. There's so many good things to do. How I do my scales, how I want to practice my scales, what I'm thinking about in my scales, and intonation, which is such a huge part of what we do. Thinking about the intonation, the overtones on the instrument. These are all things that I've been focusing on. It's keeping me busy. Somebody has a question about fifths for a Piatti Caprice. So you're talking about well, fifths are hard. They're hard to get in tune, obviously, and can be problematic because you have to completely change your hand position. So when you're playing a barred fifth, you can't be in the normal hand position that you would be with your elbow high. I think it's important not to squeeze the thumb when you're doing fifths. So if you're having difficulty, there's a good chance that you're using your opposable thumb to grab the fingerboard, to hold down that fifth. You're struggling with intonation, you start to squeeze, you get tighter and tighter. This area gets tight. It's very hard to adjust when you're grabbing and squeezing. For me, when I have a fifth, I imagine that I'm about to do a pull-up, and I'm hanging on a bar. My arm is just hanging from the fingerboard. Then I can release the tension in my hand and don't have to apply too much energy. I can have a better control of the intonation. I'm also more relaxed for the sound. I listen for the ring. So if that's an issue in that Piatti Caprice, be aware of what this guy is doing. Is he grabbing? Is he squeezing? And think about that adjustment. See if that helps. Let's see. Is it better to try a new bow with the cello you are going to be playing it on? That's a good question. I guess this is from Sasha. You're probably looking for a bow right now. and want to know if you should be using that bow with the cello that you'll be playing. I would assume so, because everything is connected, and if the bow works on that cello, it might not work on another cello, depending on that specific cello and the kind of sound. Also, a certain cello can be brighter and darker, and a bow can be brighter and darker, and so you're not getting the true picture of what you're going to get. So I would absolutely want to have the same cello for the bow that I was trying out. It's like when we have had new members in our quartet. We want to be aware of the instrument that they're bringing to the group, because it changes the whole dynamic of the quartet sound. So whenever anybody in our quartet changes an instrument, the blend, everything is different, and we notice it right away. And it can be good, it can be challenging. It's maybe something we can get used to, but I think it's important. Yeah. How would you approach an exercise for thumb position? It's from FIAR, but I don't know. It's from FIAR, but I don't know why I can't upload. I have to keep my thumb on the A and D natural harmonics, and I have to put my first finger on B flat. Should I try to keep a natural position and touch the string with my nail, or let my index bend inwards? Okay, that totally makes sense. So you're talking about this position. I think that's what you mean. That how do you get that B flat to be comfortable? So there are things you can do here to change your position. So if you stay here, you're going to have to turn that finger in this way, and you're going to be playing on the nail. Sometimes you have to play a little bit that way. It really depends on the passage, but this is why I love things like the Starker and the Kosman and I forget, it starts with a K. It's a great double stop exercise. That you have to make these little adjustments to get the intonation right. So on a note like this, maybe experiment with what you're doing here in the angle. So to get the D octave in tune, I have to bring my arm around. To get a comfortable B flat, D, B flat, my arm is going to be back here. And I'm sorry I'm turned backwards. I don't know how to fix that without doing anything crazy. I hope that helps. Bye, Samin. Somebody is asking me, great to hear you, Ace, for fast staccato playing. I guess it depends on the passage and what you're trying to do with it. Again, somebody asked the difference between staccato or spiccato and sautille, and so if it's really, really fast, you might want to think about that particular motion. Is it a springy bow stroke? Is it something that's going to be on the string, and you're going to let it spring? You're going to let the bow spring off the string from a controlled standpoint, or is it a motion that involves a bouncing bow? And this can be a little bit of an arc from the arm, where you're just letting the bow drop onto the string. So if that's your issue, then it has to be. I think it's important when it doesn't work that the hand is not grabbing the bow, and you're not trying to do something here. By squeezing, you're grabbing. The hand has to have a lot of flexibility. You have to let the bow do the work. You have to let the bow bounce. There's a motion up here. Again, it's a little bit like a smiley face. Now, if you're playing a part of the repertoire that's, like the second movement of Elgar or Rococo Last Variation, then this is more of a... I think the best way to practice that is in that rhythmic figure, which is short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long, and then maybe ba-da-da-da, then you add a couple of them. It's a great way to develop that sautier, quick springing bow stroke. There's great exercises in the Sevchek bowing exercises that I think can develop that, but it's something that, if you haven't been practicing it for a while, you have to go back and do those exercises. But it's something we're all up against all the time, and one of the bigger challenges. And then the other challenge is doing those strokes with the different string crossings that are involved in those passages, and how to control the bow from one string to the next. So that's a whole other issue. Hi, Nick. Question for I'm a 6'1" bodybuilder with a large and heavy arm. Tips for producing a beautiful resonant sound. Positioning of cello arm path. Okay. Well, there are certain issues with being tall. The majority of the time, being tall and the things that we do are really positive. Sometimes I've noticed for cellists that having really long arms and being tall creates some issues. I'm 5'8", so I don't necessarily have that problem. But I think one of the issues is back here for people with long arms. So I don't know if this is an issue for you or not. And having heavy arms, I think if you're trying to play back here, it might be an adjustment of what you can do with your positioning of your cello. I know that a lot of tall people will play with the bent in pin, and that creates a little more gravity and a little more space. Or maybe the cello is a little further forward so that they don't feel like you're reaching back. That causes tension over here. Now, in terms of I think it's important if you say you're a bodybuilder, you might have to work on keeping those muscles loose, because any sort of tightening in those big muscle groups, especially these, shoulder, elbow, wrist area, is it's going to give you challenges for flexibility and getting around the instrument. So finding ways to relax, to hang from the instrument, to feel gravity is really, really important. And making sure when you're practicing that you're not tensing up those muscles. That's the biggest thing I think cellists fight with is tension. Is trying to muscle through things, putting a little energy, and we have to avoid that. So I think it's important that you find freedom. And I think it's these big muscles, even the neck. That's probably our biggest joint. Then the shoulders, and the elbows and the wrists, and all these little joints we have here in the hand, then all these knuckles and smaller joints that have to be flexible. So if any one of those muscles develops tension, everything is affected. If you're tight over here in this shoulder, it's hard not to be tight over here. So if you're squeezing and you're tightening up this area or your bicep, it's going to connect over here. Same thing over here. If you're feeling tension in your muscles up here and you're raising your shoulder, you're going to start to squeeze over here. So it's the hardest thing about relieving tension and relaxing is that everything pretty much has to find that balance. And the more relaxed you are, this is one of the things I remember from being young, and I really just kind of tried to muscle through things, and I didn't think it was such a big deal to tighten up and raise. But when I started to be aware of it, just to be aware of what I was doing and to relax, the thing that I noticed the most was I was listening better. Like I could hear, I was aware of what was going on, what I was actually producing. With the tension and the squeezing, it affects my hearing and my ability to really sort of be almost a spectator of my own playing. So I keep on coming back to that, but I think it's finding, if you feel that, tightness or any of that is getting in your way, you have to figure out a way of sort of overcoming that. Great question. Somebody asked, should vibrato have a shape with every note? And I mentioned that earlier. I think that is so important, that the vibrato is not one-dimensional and is not a part of phrasing, that all phrasing is done here. But I mean, I think that, every note, it's like the way what Casal said is in The Art of Interpretation, there's constantly a change in the shape of a phrase from note to note. And I think that's very true here as well. So when you have a passage, this note is not the same as that, or this. So that the vibrato is a part of that. It's a part of that shape, and it's has to do with speed and intensity, and you have to internalize it. I don't think you can just think slow, faster, a little bit faster, a little bit more. You have to feel the phrase. It has to be inside of you, and then these things will start to happen. But I've been trained that way from a young age. Throughout my training from my teachers was that I had to develop the vibrato and add color and add shape with the vibrato. So I love that question. I think that's something that I don't know. I hear a lot of playing. I shouldn't say that. It makes me sound old and but I do hear a lot of playing where the vibrato is on autopilot and it doesn't have the creativity or the color that it could. So it's something of course, we all need to think about. Thank you for that question. Oh boy. Somebody wants to know, there's some good questions here. Somebody wants to know about the third suite and the prelude and the difficult passage that we have in the pedal section with the thumb. And is the question about how to practice that? Finding the balance in these double stops and just focusing on the double stops, getting the intonation. It's incredibly difficult. And then you throw the bow in the mix. So I would start with just finding this, finding the right balance, not pressing too hard. So when I see somebody struggling with it, I often see a wrong position here and squeezing going on here, and the shoulder is tight. So finding a way of playing it with ease. And whenever you watch a really great cellist and a great performance, it looks like it's just the easiest thing. It's a piece of cake. It's a walk in the park. And there's very little effort involved, and their focus is completely on the phrasing and the shaping, and it just looks so effortless. And this is a really hard passage. So finding a way of practicing it very slowly, double stops, just to get that. Now, I think the right hand is harder than the left hand now, because I've looked at the Anna Magdalena markings. To me, it looks very clearly like 3 and 1 bowing. 3. So 3. And it, from even before, the section before is clearly 3 and 1, so I don't see why this should be changed. A lot of people do it. It's a lot easier. I prefer, as hard as it is, the 3 and 1, I prefer it. So going back to flexibility here. A looseness, a flexibility in the hand is really, really important. Practicing it in rhythms. Trying to also, sorry, this is so difficult. trying to also find a balance in the bow so that you're not using incredible amount of motion and energy here, but that you're always kind of balanced between two strings. Your lower string is closer to your upper string. It's the smallest motion you can find. I hope that helps. It's a challenging spot. It's a great way to maybe warm up every day and talk about your double stops and finding it. Now, some people have trouble with that octave and will change and play a G as opposed to that. So, especially if you have a smaller hand, I have a pretty big hand, so I don't have an excuse, but it sounds fine to play the G, and so that's another way of avoiding that major pitfall right there. Here's a question. When I try to make that circular motion and change of up, down bows, my bow slides down and I lose that contact point with the string. Any tips on how to fix this issue? I would have to kind of see what's going on. So you're saying that the bow slides. It could be something that you're doing over here in the angle of the bow as you go out in the bow, that you're changing this angle too much and the bow is crooked. So if the bow is crooked, you're going to slide. If the bow is crooked, either way, there's going to be sliding going on. If your bow angle is right where it needs to be, no slide. So I would pay attention to the bow angle and see if that helps you. Now, if it's something you're doing in the circle that's changing it, that's also a problem. But I think just having your eye on your bow when you're practicing and making sure that you're still keeping perpendicular to the string. Now, sometimes bow angles are great when you want to change contact points. That's really good. It's okay to be crooked, but if you don't want to lose that sound that you have, just having your visual on the bow, keeping that bow in place. It takes a certain concentration to focus on the bow. I think we're always sort of worried about all this stuff, and then you throw legato bowings in and you're focused on that. But I think you probably need to think about those circles as well as that. Hopefully that can help you. Okay, defining pieces you've learned. What is that? I'm not sure. Why would one elect to play in a quartet as opposed to an orchestra? That's a good question. I mean, some people love the feeling of playing in an orchestra, the big sound, again, great repertoire, how bold and heroic it can be, and just being able to play with brass and percussion and winds and a big section. And the repertoire is fantastic, and it's great. What I like about playing in a string quartet is that it's so communicative. There's no conductor, so you have to really sort of, you have to listen in anything you do. Orchestral playing is chamber music, but there's a sort of a connection with four instruments, just four of like-minded instruments, string instruments, that are the range of the human voice. So that combination is really special. You've got the bass, the tenor, the alto, the soprano, and the combination of those four, the blend of sound you can get, the colors you can get with the string quartet, and the fact that the repertoire is so incredibly personal. All the great composers wrote some of their best works were for string quartet. Beethoven in particular wrote 16 of some of the greatest music ever written. His last 5 works were all string quartets. At the end of his life, he wasn't concerned with fame or money or anything like that. He wrote music that he thought was his most personal music, his most experimental, and he chose the string quartet. And I think a lot of composers followed Beethoven's footsteps. Even composers now are writing some incredible string quartets. So the repertoire is, I think, very special. Not that the orchestral repertoire isn't. I love the freedom to sit down with 3 other people and discuss phrasing and character and be able to. I also think that there's a flexibility in how much you can put into your rehearsing. I think with an orchestra, there's a strict schedule. It has to be that way. There's no other way. There are too many people. So these are some of the things I like about string quartet. And there are other things that many people would not like about the difficulty of playing in a string quartet, such as the fact that we're traveling a lot, getting on planes, that, it's just 4 people. And so can be tension, whereas a rehearsal, you have a conductor and you can go your own way. And quartet is you're so close. It's very, it's almost like a marriage between 4 people. You're spending all that time together. So they both have their upsides and their downsides. If you were to ask me why I chose string quartet playing, and I feel very lucky to be doing that, I was exposed to some great string quartets growing up, and my teacher was Paul Katz was a cellist of the Cleveland Quartet, and I was around that for 4 years and hearing them play, and then got to work with the Tokyo Quartet after that, and members of the Juilliard Quartet, and falling in love with probably those Beethoven quartets and the Bartok quartets, and it's just I feel lucky that that's the way I can make my living as a musician and get to perform that repertoire. So, but I love playing orchestra too, and I could have seen going another way. If I had to do it over again, I don't know. Who knows? Good question. Somebody wants to know about extension. Forward extensions, when the first finger is on, say, the D string and the extension is on the G string. First finger is on the D string and the extension is on the G string. So you mean like something like that? Well, a couple things. I mean, any extension is going to involve opening the hand. And not just the hand, but the thumb as well. And an arm motion as well. Now, so this is the motion of extension. It's like an accordion, so opening up, yeah. Now, if you're going to the C string and you're playing a third, you also have to balance on that C sharp on the G string. And so the arm has to not only extend, but I would say come forward to find that new note. Now, there are a lot of things involved. If you're just going to a note, you're done with it, then you can release the 4th finger. But if you're playing it as a double stop, then you have to stay in that position. But if that's giving you problems, think about what's going on over here. Are you just reaching out and stretching? Or are you being mobile? I like to think of the motion of riding a bike. When you ride a bike, you have freedom here. You're turning right, you're coming this way, you're turning left, you're going this way. And you can feel that from your hips. So that little extension is not just here in the hand. It's not just that, but it's that. I'm even turning with my cello a little bit to get over there with my knee. So there are a lot of things going on, but I feel it in the hips. So maybe that will help you think about that little motion and what's going on there. I wish I was not turned around backwards. Okay. More unfamiliar pieces you think every cellist should know, and what pieces you recommend for a graduate student. Okay, yeah. There are some great pieces, modern pieces written for the cello. There are some also lost pieces, not lost, but composers from the 20th century who were neglected that wrote some great music. I love some of the Russian composers. Miaskovsky wrote two beautiful sonatas for cello that are fantastic, that are really worth learning. Very, very romantic. In Weinberg, another 20th century contemporary of Shostakovich, wrote some fantastic cello music. That's and great quartets. So those are some examples of some 20th century repertoire that is, I think, really worth looking into. And there are so many great pieces that are being written. If I were thinking about programming, and you say you're a graduate student, you want to find something interesting. There's so many pieces online that you can watch. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but I was introduced to a piece by an Israeli composer named Ben Haim, I think is his name. I could be pronouncing that wrong. 3 pieces for cello, fantastic. But there are so many, and trying to discover some of these works. Maybe it's somebody you know, or maybe it's a friend told you about a piece that they love playing. It's worth exploring, because there's a lot of great repertoire that's neglected, that should be played. Trying to think offhand, a lot of the repertoire, I'm thinking is stuff that is played. But look into what's been written in the last 20 years and see what you can find. Somebody wants to know about any tips for helping one play the barrelage section from the first suite. Are you talking about just in general the beginning, or are you talking about later on in the arpeggiated section? Well, again, we've talked a lot about how to work on stuff. We were talking about that kind of bowing in the third suite. Practicing in double stops, and I've said it already a couple times, practicing in double stops is a great way to sort of set your bow in those smaller positions, so you're balanced over the strings without overusing bow motion. And it also sets the intonation in the left hand, so that the left hand, especially in these passages, what I notice when things aren't going well, sometimes I see, or I am doing myself, I'm not keeping my fingers down in the left hand, and that affects these barrelage passages. So if I'm kind of lifting fingers here, that affects it. So finding comfortable balance and realizing when you should keep your fingers down and not change is really, really important. And then practicing those double stops. Working on a very loose and flexible right hand. So again, talking about those little circles here in the wrists, and depending on where you are doing it in the bow, how to make those happen smoothly. Just takes, and again, really, really important if you're having trouble with one of those passages, isolate it in double stops and do it incredibly slowly a few times so that you're really aware of what's going on in the bow hand, how much motion you're using, is the left hand balanced, is your intonation solid, and then you can gradually speed it up. But it's something that I don't feel like we spend enough time. I know when I was young, I didn't practice slowly. Sometimes I have to really force myself to slow down, but when I do the really slow, careful practice, really slow motion, that's when I can really figure out what I'm doing, and I'm really aware of it. You give your brain enough time to figure out those little motions, and can be very rewarding. So, good question. Somebody wants to know what specifically needs to happen in the left arm to allow the left hand to be more free in higher positions. Well, well, I know the things that you want to avoid doing. You're talking about the arm in higher positions. I think some of the problems we see is a broken arm, which is this, bent here, and that's usually accompanied by a lot of tension, either in the biceps or in the wrist, especially in the wrist, and that's a lack of balance. So when you're on the fingerboard, you want to be as balanced as you can, and you want to be as loose as you can. And I said it earlier, it has to do with having the arm in the right position and also not feeling like you have to squeeze or press the fingerboard. So something about, we see a lot of this, you want to get an intense vibrato and something very excited and dramatic in the upper positions, and you start to squeeze. And then you start to tighten here, as opposed to finding a position that looks balanced. You can feel that sort of sense of balance, and the weight is in the string, and you're not having to press. Maybe you're slightly pulling back this way. It really has to do with the elbow height, too. If the elbow's too high, not a good thing. If it's too low, it's not a good thing. You've got to find the right position that feels good. I do feel, though, in the high positions, if you're working on, like a... it's okay to have some firmness in the elbow for the vibrato. So if you're working on an intense vibrato in the higher positions, if you're too relaxed here, you can lose that focus or intensity. But it's always challenging. Yeah, good question. Thank you. Somebody asks, Faith asks about any ensemble rehearsal tips. That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, ensemble, I assume you're talking about playing things together with a similar articulation. In a quartet, one of the hardest things that we have to come across is matching articulations. If things are not together, sometimes the problem is not just are we playing in the same tempo. It could just be where are we in the bow? What kind of articulation are we using? So trying to be aware of those things. But if there's a particular passage that's not together, it's also helpful to, for in a quartet, you might want to break it up and do things in pairs, and then maybe add a person or change the pairing so that you can really focus on just one other person. My feeling about ensemble playing, though, is what I often see and notice, and sometimes in our quartet when things aren't going well, we are trying too hard to play together and not thinking about what will make us play together. And most of the time, it's thinking about phrasing and direction. So if you have a phrase and if everybody's trying to show the beats and it's got a very vertical feel, or if you're thinking about, of course you have to have a pulse, but if you're thinking about every beat and you're not thinking about a long phrase or a crescendo going to here or a hairpin, once you start to think and discuss the phrasing, it solves a lot of those ensemble issues. So I think that's a really important aspect of ensemble playing, not just to think about the lining up factor, but the direction, and even the character. Depending on what character you're playing, if you've discussed it as a group, and you know that this passage is going to be incredibly tender, and it's going to be pianissimo, and it's going to be very sort of personal and inviting, you're going to play it a little differently, and you start listening. And ensemble playing is about really listening to each other, and that's such a great skill to have. So the more chamber music you play, the more time you spend playing quartets, the more it opens your ears, gets your antennas aware of what's going around you. I think it adds to so much of your playing as a musician in terms of opening your ears. It changes the way you approach playing the instrument when you're listening this way. Kind of oftentimes relaxes you because you're not thinking about every little thing you're doing on the instrument, but you're thinking about how you're affecting what's going on around you, or how you're being pulled or communicating to what's going on around you. So I think that's important. I mean, of course, if it's something you need to use a metronome, if it's about a tempo, it's a good tool. Playing with metronome, I'm not against that. We do that often, and it can solve a lot of problems. Sometimes, if we're having a particular problem about how to shape something and we're not together, and it's maybe a transition going to a different tempo, we'll just say it. We say it, we try to say it with conviction. If we just say it without conviction, it's not going to be helpful. But if we actually say it and kind of move it like we're playing it, it often solves that ensemble problem. We pick our instruments back up and we play it, no issue. Weilerstein, I remember, used to have us do an exercise where we only do the left hand, but we move and we show each other what we're doing, and we kind of listen to our articulations. And I didn't quite understand it at first, but it really, really works. So there are certain exercises that you can do to help your ensemble. Even just getting rid of the instrument and trying to think about what the music is doing. Because once a group of musicians in an ensemble is thinking about where you're headed musically, it even fixes intonation. I don't know why, but you start to listen differently, and everybody's on the same page. And there you go. You're not having those issues you might have been having. Great question. Thank you for that. Somebody asked, what are your thoughts on how to productively learn from recordings? So a lot of people say, oh, don't listen to recordings. It's going to influence you too much, and it's not the best way to do it. You should not do that. And I think I like to do both. I think I've learned so much from listening to recordings. And we're so lucky to have the internet now. When I was a student, we didn't have that. And it's so much easier to learn things. Now, if you just decide you're going to learn a piece from a recording, that's a big mistake, because then you're not really thinking. And you're just, there's a million cellists out there who've tried to imitate Elgar Concerto from Dupre recordings. And it's not the way to go as a musician. I think you have to look at the score. You have to get an understanding of the markings and what they mean. If you're learning Schumann Concerto, there are so many interesting accents and dynamics and things that you can interpret. And when you do them, the music just makes so much more sense. Beethoven in the quartets, just focusing on those markings can bring so much meaning to what you're doing, as opposed to just trying to learn it off a recording. But on the other hand, you can get great ideas from musicians that you respect that will play something. Hopefully every recording is different, and the way you think about music, it's opening you up to ideas that can be phenomenal. Listening to different people play Bach in their different ways makes you think about the possibilities and understand how somebody like Bilsma will use articulation and bowing, and how Casals played Bach, and how Fournier, and how I listened to the Hollywood Quartet and the Polish Quartet recently, and how amazing those old quartets were. And sort of the Hollywood Quartet had sort of an austere way of playing, and not very moving very much, but like such a great idea of how the music should be. And you learn a lot from the way the old quartets and the old musicians played. So recordings are great. I don't know. I think just to make sure that you sit down with the score before you dive into a new piece. And so you've thought about it, you understand it before jumping into a recording and deciding that that's going to be how you're going to learn that piece. And not just one recording. You got to listen to many. And you don't want to sit there and play with a recording and try to copy it. You just get an idea. you think about it. But again, the internet is a very valuable thing for us now. It's at your fingertips right away. You can hear pretty much a million people, not just hear them, but you can watch them. It's invaluable. Oh, this is a good question. A teacher has told me I have short arms. Would there be a benefit to using a 7/8 or 3/4 bow with my full-size cello? Yeah, I've thought a lot about that. I've had a couple students who had short arms and had trouble at the tip, and always trying to find ways of helping them at the tip so that they could get out there and feel comfortable. But I don't know. That's an interesting idea. Yeah, I think I have come across a few people who played with a little bit shorter bow for that reason. Also, there are some cellos that are on the smaller side, shorter string length, and or even just being thinner. Some of the cellos are really big, and if you're played with a little bit shorter bow for that reason. Also, there are some cellos that are on the smaller side, shorter string length, and or even just being thinner. Some of the cellos are really big, and if you're